So on behalf of Michael Barkham and Wolfgang Lutz, I would like to welcome you to the fifth webinar based on the seventh editions of the Bergin and Garfield Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change. This series of webinars is jointly sponsored by the Society of Psychotherapy Research, SPR, the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, SEPI, and the American Psychological Association Division 29, the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. The series aim at keeping the handbook alive, hopefully guiding the thinking, the practice, training, and research of students, clinicians, trainers, and or investigator interested in understanding and improving psychotherapy around the world. Previous webinar, I've addressed the combinations of psychotherapy and medications, quantitative methods to investigate psychotherapy, training and supervision, as well as psychodynamic, humanistic, existential, and systemic therapies. These past webinars, as well as a preamble of them featuring Alan Bergin and Mike Lambert, who were the editors of previous editions of the handbook, have been recorded and are posted on the SPR website. We are happy to let you know that one other webinar is already being scheduled on November 13 at noon Eastern Time. Mary Beth Connolly-Gibbons and Bruce Wample will be presenting on process outcome research and the therapist effect. And others are being organized as we plan to have 10 webinars or so covering most of the chapter of the handbook. Today, we're very fortunate to have major leaders of the field who have contributed not to one, but to two distinct chapters on qualitative research: Heidi Levitt, John McLeod, and Bill Stiles. The webinar will be lasting 60 minutes and will involve 4 segments, 3 given by each of the presenters respectively, and 1 segment of 15 minutes for discussion among them, as well as questions from all of us. Without further ado, I'm now inviting Heidi to present.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Louis. I'm just going to put up my slides. And so I'm Heidi Levitt from UMass Boston, and I'll be talking about causality and generalization, and thinking about how these are central to qualitative psychotherapy research. In our presentation, we're each bringing forward ideas that we think are important and interesting to focus on from the many within the 2 chapters. So, psychology has had an early grounding in positivist philosophy, which has really emphasized the observable, the biological, the measurable, and emphasize theories of regularity. So thinking about causality is something that looks at what happens before and what happens after an event, and then looks at the regularity in pattern before and then after. So you can see here these little metal balls, and if I swing the first ball, I should see the ball at the end kick out. And I should see this in a regular pattern, and that regularity lets me think this is a causal pattern. There was an excellent special issue of Psychotherapy Research focused on causality and psychotherapy research. Also, 2 excellent panels, one by Hannah Odeley and one by Falkenstrom at SPR, with this kind of theme in mind. So it's a theme that has really caught people's imagination and interest within our society. More recently, philosophers of science and methodologists have been emphasizing the potential of rethinking how causality relates to qualitative research, and really thinking about what's inside the black box. So, yikes, I'm going to actually stop using my mouse. So if you look at this image here, figure B, we get a different picture, right? Because suddenly there's this guy here, right? And what is he doing? And why is he doing it? And who is he? And how did he get here? And where did he come from? We have entirely new questions that we haven't been thinking about, which are about the process that's happening within the change, and what's happening within minds as the change is unfolding. And so this is a different kind of way of thinking about causality and thinking about the potential for qualitative research to look at and identify causal processes. So, all right, my mouse is like super sensitive, I notice. So so we've talked a lot about variation within quantitative methods, and we often neglect to talk about how variation works in qualitative methods. But in both approaches, the idea of change is incredibly important in orienting us to making meaning and developing findings. But we think about what are the changes that are of use to us? What are the changes that are important? And in qualitative research, one way of capturing types of variation and change is through the hermeneutic circle. And here the idea is that we take a piece of data, we develop an understanding of it, and then we look to a second piece of data and we develop an understanding of that piece. And that can inform our understanding of the first piece of data. It may change it, it may reinforce it, it may strengthen it, it may alter it. And we engage in a cyclical process through which we're looking at the individual pieces of data and the whole data set, and continuing to refine our understanding of our phenomenon, and engaging cyclically with different sorts of inferential processes, different sorts of processes of understanding. And gradually the idea is that our meanings become less malleable, they become more encompassing, they become better, more thorough, more worked out. And this is a self-correcting kind of process. David Rennie wrote about this 2012. This idea of being self-correcting is really important if we're thinking about establishing causality. Qualitative research is interesting because of the types of variation that it maps. So whereas in quantitative studies, we're really looking at variation in quantity, right? In does my variable increase or decrease or remain the same? But in qualitative research, we can be identifying unvarying experience, right? Like descriptive phenomenology focuses on what is the essential unchanging component that defines an experience. It's a different kind of way of thinking about variation. We can identify variation through looking at how does a phenomenon increase or decrease, but also how it transforms. So it may be that my fear in therapy that doesn't just decrease, but my contact with anger increases. Maybe it transforms into anger and there's a shift that happens, or maybe it stays the same, but there's some transformation in type or experience that's important to capture. Qualitative theories also increase researchers' perspicacity to settle kinds of variation. So critical researchers, psychoanalytic researchers, we use theory to guide our analysis and to help us notice types of variation that may be quite subtle and might be hard to notice absent our theories. And we also focus a lot on contextual, social, and interpersonal cues for variation. So really identifying what is the pattern through which experiences shift. What are the interactions that lead a client to improve or to decompensate, right? And not just looking at the fact that there was decompensation, but why was there and why in this context with these people. So Joe Maxwell has been writing a series of articles, and I've collaborated with him on one, looking at causal processes and thinking about how qualitative research is very adept at identifying the processes that unfold within the change process. So whereas quantitative studies look at whether causality, a causal relationship can be established or not established, qualitative research looks at, well, what are the processes through which change occurs? And so thinking about how these different approaches, qualitative and quantitative, are really aimed at distinctive kinds of questions. Does change happen versus how, and through what processes does it happen? Sometimes people talk about there being a hierarchy of evidence, but it doesn't really make sense if you understand that the questions are actually distinctive. And they're very adept at identifying de novo kinds of patterns, right? And patterns that are not grounded in prior hypotheses, but are really coming from inductively driven analyses of data by looking at shifts in meaning, context, and process. So we talked a little bit about causality and the idea that qualitative methods are useful at identifying causal processes. So now I'm going to shift to talk about, for a couple of minutes, generalization. If I can find the right slide. So in qualitative researchers have often thought that our methods don't generalize, right? You'll often see this in people's limitation sections for qualitative research, and instead have focused on this idea of transferability, which is the idea that readers can absorb findings and then can decide how they want to apply those findings to their own research context or their own clinical context or whatnot. But again, cutting edge approaches to qualitative generalization have been articulating a methodological basis for transferability. There's a special issue of qualitative psychology that's just focused on generalizability, and a whole series of authors tackling this question. And thinking about how once you consider the variability in your data and analysis and articulate how that relates to context, you can really articulate what are the boundaries and you can support as a qualitative researcher findings that can be generalized. But a shift that I think is important to make is that we're not generalizing to the population, but we're generalizing to the phenomenon, right? So thinking that we're thinking about all the variation that exists within the phenomenon that we're studying, and we're trying to map that variation within the phenomenon within the scope of our question, right? So we're doing this by engaging again in this self-correcting cycle of inferences, examining stability and variation both as they occur, explicating details on context, process, dynamics, and this also helps us understand qualitative research as being freed from concerns around the end of the study, right? We're not using sampling and we're not looking for statistical generalization. And instead thinking about how do we really map the variation within our phenomenon in a way that is useful and has fidelity to our phenomenon. Okay, so this logic about generalizing to the phenomenon is already inherent in the kinds of participant selection that many qualitative methods use. We think about the variation within the phenomenon when we select participants for case studies, when we engage in theoretical sampling within grounded theory. We look at our evolving data set and we think, what kinds of variation are missing here? How can we recruit people that can comment and help us evolve and flesh out types of variation that are missing? This is present in imaginal variation within phenomenology, thinking about how can we conceptualize all the different ways that our phenomenon might vary. And within purposive sampling strategies like maximal variation, right? So qualitative researchers are already in processes of participant selection, thinking about variation within the phenomenon. So grounding generalization within that makes more sense. It's more logical for qualitative research. So here I've really quickly reviewed a couple of cutting edge kinds of responses to these unyielding questions that are put to qualitative researchers, it seems like unceasingly and historically. So the questions that we often receive are, can qualitative methods establish whether causality exists? And can they generalize findings to the population? And often we're asked to apologize for not doing this, right, within our limitation sections, which doesn't really make sense because this question is erroneous and it's based on a misunderstanding of the inferential processes that are inherent in qualitative methods. And instead, what we should be thinking is that qualitative methods can be understood as identifying causal processes within the change process, right? Rather than establishing whether the causal relationships exist or not. And as generalizing findings to the phenomenon, not to the population. And so engaging in population based sampling and statistical generalization is not the route to generalization for qualitative methods. So I'm just thinking about these methods as having a distinctive logic, one in which a self-correcting model of stability and variation evolves through a hermeneutic process, and then its boundaries and conditions can be articulated to facilitate generalization and transferability and leave us with understanding causality in a new way. That's it for me.
Many thanks, Heidi. Very thought-provoking, really great. I believe now, Bill, that you're the next person.
Unmute, there we go. And then I need to see if I can figure out how to share my screen properly here. This one, I think. All right. Now, let's see. What I need to, let's see, can I move this down? Oh, there we go. All right. Now, okay, that works. Good. Okay, my talk also it deals with some of these epistemological concerns. Okay, so in what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, research provides quality control on theory by making observations and comparing them with prevailing theory. If they match, that justifies an increment in confidence in the theory. If they don't match, it's a problem. Often the problem is with the method or the measures, but if the method's okay, the mismatch usually means that the theory needs to be fixed in one way or another. Very rarely, a mismatch leads to abandoning the theory. I want to argue that qualitative methods, such as case studies, can be used to make scientific observations, that is, to build theories, so qualitative as well as quantitative methods. Now, when I say theory, I'm talking about explanatory theory, which is what Kuhn might call normal scientific theory. Explanatory theories deal with issues like causation and mechanism, which is what Heidi was talking about. And also I'm talking about research on existing theory, not on inventing a new theory. So often in our field, the word theory gets used to mean something more like treatment protocol, the sort of thing that you'd test in a clinical trial. And I'm not talking about that. So I'm not talking about what works so much as how it works. Okay, this slide makes the key point in my part of this this part of the webinar. So it describes an idea that came to me from Donald Campbell via Elliot Mishler. Campbell was a prominent methodologist when I was in school. He wrote widely used textbooks about experimental design. And in those, he said a lot of mean things about case studies and other N of 1 kinds of studies. But then late in his career, he wrote a paper where he quoted all those mean things he'd said and explicitly retracted them and said, well, maybe there's something in case studies. He described what I call the degrees of freedom logic. So he was writing about case studies, but the same logic holds, I think, for other kinds of qualitative research. Okay. The first, so to contrast the statistical hypothesis testing study. So consider the textbook account this statistical hypothesis testing strategy. So first, we just derive some statement from a theory, and then we compare that statement with many observations. That is, we test a hypothesis by seeing if it holds across cases. If the observations tend to correspond to the statement, then our confidence in that statement is substantially increased. We say the hypothesis was confirmed, or at least the null hypothesis was rejected. And this justifies a small increment of confidence in the theory that it was derived from. The case study strategy, and this is the key point, is to compare each of many theoretically based statements with only one or a few observations each. And this can be done by describing the case in theoretical terms, attending to what doesn't fit as well as what's well described by the theory and what isn't well described. So being even-handed, and keeping in mind that different parts of the theory may apply in different cases. So at issue is the correspondence of theory and observation, how well the theory describes the details of this case. Each theoretically based statement that accurately describes a case observation is a kind of tiny confirmation. So each detail may be observed only once, so the change in confidence in any one theoretical statement considered independently will be very small, but there's lots of details. And because many statements are examined, the study may justify an increment in confidence in the theory that's as large as from a statistical hypothesis testing study. That's the key point. That is that both are trying to build confidence in a theory or question the theory, and there are these different strategies. So Campbell argued that these multiple observations of cases are analogous to the multiple degrees of freedom in a statistical hypothesis testing study, and that's where the name comes from. Theories in the human sciences, including psychotherapy, are meant to encompass much more than's ever encountered in one case or one set of interviews. Qualitative research can encompass these details of context, personality, relationships, responsive interaction. It's not limited to just one or a few variables or to variables that have been quantified. Distinctive or unique features can be used. They don't have to be ignored or treated as errors. And this degrees of freedom logic then shows how all of this can be brought to bear on theory. Of course, the increment from any one study of either type is small, right? So and qualitative observations suffers from most of the same threats to validity as any hypothesis testing study. We have selective sampling, biases, errors of observation or measurement, or so forth. There's ways of dealing with those. But nevertheless, a series of systematically analyzed cases that match a theory in precise or unexpected detail may yield a good deal of confidence in the theory. And I think this logic explains why some classic case studies have had so much impact. I mean, for example, Dora in psychoanalysis, or Little Albert for behaviorism, or Dibs for non-directive play therapy. I think readers are impressed because the theories explain so many details, including some that are contrary to intuition or popular wisdom. Likewise, I suspect that many of us chose our favorite account or after reading or presentations or personal experiences of cases that fit our theory in detail. This use of qualitative methods works to the degree that the theory is logically coherent, that is, internally consistent with its parts logically linked to each other, okay? The logical coherence is needed so observations bearing on one part of the theory can support the rest of the theory. So, I mean, note that that hypothesis testing also requires logical coherence for the same reason. Hypotheses are derived from the theory. If the theory's parts are not logically interlinked, then support for the hypothesis wouldn't bear on the theory, and the textbook hypothesis testing method wouldn't work. So even in physics, You remember maybe the excitement a few years ago about confirming the existence of the Higgs boson. I mean, this was exciting not because people care so much about bosons, but because it supported a key hypothesis derived from the standard model in physics, which is the current cornerstone theory of the physical universe, very general. So, of course, theories in our field are not quite so tightly reasoned as in physics, but the need for logical coherence is still the same. Okay. Okay, must have missed the slide. Okay, I wanted, I'll just say something here. So theories are made of words. As I use the term, a theory is a semiotic construction. That is, it's made from signs, such as words and numbers and diagrams. So a theory is a concrete thing that anybody can see. People's understanding of the theory is something else. So ideally, a scientific theory and its terms should mean the same thing across people and time. Terms need stable meanings for deductive logic to work. So now stable meanings are very unnatural. In everyday discourse, people often understand words and statements differently from each other. That's why scientists spend so much time trying to be precise about what they mean. Maybe it's why they always seem so attracted to numbers. This emphasis on meaning, that is on always meaning the same thing, is a key difference between what we call theory building research and enriching research in our chapters. My section in this webinar is about theory building research, not enriching research. In enriching research, terms and theories, enriching qualitative research, which is a lot of qualitative research, terms and theories may mean different things at different times to different people. Unpacking and understanding these very varied meanings is an important and interesting part of enriching research. I don't know what happened to that slide. Anyway, this is my last slide, and it's about logic. 3 logical operations. So 2 I've talked about really. Deduction is the process of formal logic. It's what underlies the maintaining of internal consistency and deriving hypotheses that I've been talking about. Induction is the logic of evidence. So scientific theories can never be directly confirmed. Technically, support for a derivation from a theory is affirming the consequent, which is a fallacy in deductive logic. But by inductive reasoning, making observations that are consistent with the theory justifies an increment of confidence in the theory. So it's always probabilistic. Abduction, the new interesting one, describes changing theories to accommodate new observations. It's the name for the main creative process in science. It sometimes gets lumped with induction, but it's a separate logical operation. The name seems to have come from a 19th century American philosopher called Charles Sanders Peirce. When it was introduced into psychotherapy research by David Rennie, name to conjure with. Abduction kicks in when a new observation does not fit the theory. If it's not a methodological problem, then the fix is to change the theory. And abductive reasoning says, if you make some change, then the new observation would be expected. So that change can be tentatively incorporated and become a focus for further observation. The changes may include corrections to the theory, elaborations, extensions to new domains, and so forth. Case studies and other qualitative studies, I think, are particularly likely to find anomalies in theories, places where it doesn't fit, because they look at so many different issues in each study. That's the degrees of freedom logic. So if you're alert, you can almost always find ways a theory could be repaired or expanded to better encompass new observations. And importantly, abduction is strongly constrained. The changes have to be logically consistent with the rest of the existing theory, and thereby with all the observations that the theory had already incorporated. Often, a change to one part of the theory requires adjustments to other parts to maintain logical consistency. So investigators have to be familiar with the theory and with the previous research, and they need the confidence to fix what doesn't work and to extend the scope of the theory. Then through abduction, observations accumulate in theories, if you can think about it that way. New observations are incorporated while earlier thinking and observations are retained. So a theory thus conveys in compact form the accumulated observations of all those previous researchers. When we understand a theory, we experience a kind of aggregate, a condensed aggregate of what those people have seen and thought. Okay. These are some of the references I mentioned. I'm just putting up here for a few seconds so anyone interested can copy the screen or maybe in the recording. For examples of things I've been talking about, see our handbook chapters or write to me. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yet another very thought-provoking presentation. John, this is going to be very difficult to follow 2 in a row, but I'm sure you're up to the task.
Yeah, I do not share your optimism here, but I'll do my best. Right, okay, I hope that's now visible to everybody. Yeah, it's very kind of odd experience for me to be here. I'm kind of an old retired person who spends all my time or a lot of my time looking after grandchildren and other times sitting in a room on my own writing books. So, and the other thing I like to do is to read qualitative research papers. And so what in terms of these, I'm going to kind of pick up on something that was mentioned a bit in these chapters, but not in great depth. And I think, I mean, to me, these are kind of monster kind of chapters. They're so long and so densely written, and they're so full of examples and so forth. I think it's really great that we've got the opportunity here and maybe on other occasions to sort of unpack some of it. So I think in these chapters, and I think in the field of psychotherapy research broadly, and I would give tribute to Heidi Levitt's contribution to making all this happen. I think there's now a broad consensus that qualitative research is valuable, and we've got some kind of reasonable idea of what a kind of credible qualitative study might look like. But I would say this, qualitative research is not actually having much influence on policy. So, for example, in Britain, where I live, the NICE guidelines, like recent NICE guideline for therapy for depression, kind of did not take qualitative research seriously. And I know that colleagues in other countries are finding the same thing. And it's kind of difficult to know at an individual level, you know, what therapists get from reading qualitative studies. So what I'd like to talk about really is how can we, or how should we, or how could we use qualitative research to inform practice? And something I'm not going to talk about, which is actually, I think, really, really important, is the experience of people doing a qualitative study, like as a master's level or a doctoral level, or, you know, as part of a practice research network and things. That, I think, is a very, very important thing that kind of really has helped a lot of people to bring a kind of research kind of sensibility into their practice. But I'm not going to talk about that. So what I'm going to talk about is a particular example of something that is of interest to me as a practitioner, as a therapist, and as an educator, which is around using routine outcome measures as feedback tools. So the client, you know, filling in the OQ, or in Britain, the CORE, or some sort of preference scale or something like that. And it's kind of used to inform the practice. So I'd like to have a look at some ways that qualitative research might help us to do this better. And just a little bit about my background. I mean, I'm a pluralist, you know, with Mick Cooper and many other people been involved in developing pluralistic therapy. And I think where this is relevant here and why this slide is here is that I think that to be a therapist, or to be anything really, the person or any of us use different ways of knowing. And there's different lists of ways of knowing, but this is just something that makes sense to me. This is sort of personal knowing, theoretical, practical, cultural, ethical, and scientific. And each of them has got something distinctive to offer. And why, and the client then, you know, sitting in the room with you has got their own ways of knowing, their own versions of all that. Why I think this is relevant to all this is that, to me personally, it's a fundamental error, and it's a kind of moral error, I would say, to think that therapy can be completely empirically validated or evidence-based and things like that, because that's putting too much weight on the scientific. But at the same time, I don't think it's acceptable or effective for therapy to be purely kind of based on practical skills and theory and things, because science gives you a kind of a perspective that's in contrast to that. So that's kind of behind all this. Using routine outcome measures, to me, this area of research and practice is really significant, because I think that historically psychotherapy research has been underpowered. There hasn't been enough kind of intensity of inquiry into particular topics. So we know it's like with the COVID pandemic, there were thousands of scientists all around the world trying to produce vaccines and things like that. And in my kind of long career as a therapist and a teacher and therapy researcher and so on, this is really the first time to do with feedback measures that I've seen enough research being done to actually probably allow us to be confident about what we're doing. Anyway, in relation to all that, I'd like to talk about 3 ways that qualitative studies have been valuable for me: possibility maps, counter-narratives, and dialogical knowing. And because time is short, I'm going to kind of whip through this quite quickly. So I think one of the distinctive things about qualitative research is that qualitative research is about agency, people being active agents, making decisions, constructing reality, co-constructing reality, so on and so forth, rather than being objects. Now, we are objects, we're biological objects and physical objects as human beings, but we're also agents. And one of the things about agency is, and Heidi was kind of talking about this, I think, as well, is that it calls for a different understanding of causality. And the particular kind of take on causality that I have found useful is the notion of affordances, coming from J.J. Gibson, the psychologist of perception of like 40, 50 years ago. So for Gibson, what happens in a situation is that the situation affords various possibilities of responding to that. So in terms of a feedback tool, it's not that the feedback tool, introducing the feedback tool into therapy, like at the beginning of the therapy session, it doesn't in any simple way cause various things to happen. It creates a possibility of things happen. It affords various possibilities. And so I want to give an example of this. And it was only after that I'd written this slide, I thought, oh my God, Louis is actually going to be in the audience here, and his name's on this paper. But anyway, this is a recent review paper that came out in Psychotherapy Research by Laver and others. I think possibly based in one of the Norwegian research centers. Anyway, they reviewed qualitative studies of client and therapist experience of not just routine outcome measures. Some of them were kind of preference scales and things like that, but mainly outcome measures. So they had 31 studies in their review. And what they did was they looked at all this, and they came up with 4 clusters of, they don't use the word possibility, I don't think, but I would use the word possibility, 4 clusters of types of possibility, like nomothetic, possibilities is a measure gives you the possibility of comparing this client with other clients. Intrapersonal, filling in a questionnaire, for example, gives you the chance to kind of reflect on your own experience. Interpersonal, the client and the therapist look at the scores together and it helps them to collaborate. And then a kind of ragbag of things, strategic use of the client. So the client may think, well, I've had enough of being in this outpatient clinic, so I'm going to give myself a really low score on the symptom scale so I get discharged or something like that. Okay. Now, to me, the really interesting, but the whole paper is great intro, great discussion and things, but the particularly interesting thing to me in terms of a kind of agentic possibility perspective is table 4, synthesized findings. Now, I read that carefully and I found more than 40 possibilities, 40 examples of how clients and therapists use these measures. And so this particular part of the paper is 3,000 words of highly condensed text. If you go to that paper and look at this kind of table of synthesized findings, each sentence in it has got a massive meaning in terms of conveying possibilities. And I think there's questions then about how we write up this and how we communicate this sort of thing to make it more practically useful. Because some of the things I thought, gosh, I don't do that. I'd like to know more about what made that client say that or what made that therapist say that and so forth. But anyway, now possibility mapping is a concept that I have come up with for this talk, right? So I don't have any investment in it. This may not work for other people, so on. So the next example I'd like to give is counter narratives. So we live in a culture. This is kind of to do with another distinctive feature of qualitative research, which is kind of to do with being critical, speaking truth to power, calling out imbalances of power and things like that. So we live in a culture where dominant narrative promoted by people with power, authority, and status are highly influential. But as we all know, that in most areas of life, there's other stories that ordinary people tell that are quite different. So I think, to me, one of the very kind of powerful aspects of qualitative research is this counter-storying or counter-narrative, giving people a voice to say something that's different from the kind of received wisdom. So these papers, Costa and Dutta, I think, they're kind of, to some extent, methodological examples of counter-narratives. So what I'd like to do is to look at the particular question that has interested me for a long time. How do therapists monitor client progress when they don't have measures? Obviously, therapy existed for decades before we had these routine outcome measures. So what did therapists do? Now, one of my students from years and years with Tom Daniel did a lovely little study of this. And which you might find interesting. It kind of predated, at least in Britain, the use of routine outcome measures. They were just sort of beginning to emerge. So let's look at a particular aspect of this, of the received wisdom, is that therapists are not very good at tracking progress in general, but particularly in relation to clients that are not on track, that are deteriorating, that are heading for a poor outcome. And most of many of the studies, particularly influenced by, written by, and commentaries and chapters by Michael Lambert, or people influenced by Mike Lambert, have referred to the Wallfish study about self-assessment bias. So self-assessment bias is like this kind of late woebegone phenomenon. If you ask therapists what proportion of your clients get better, therapists will say, every therapist virtually will say, 70%, 80%, things like that. That's very different from the reality. And the Hannon study was a particular study where they looked at clients that were filling in measures week by week, and they asked therapists, quite independently of that, they asked their therapist, is the client getting better or worse? They were pretty focused on not on track clients. And the therapists were actually pretty hopeless at identifying the clients who were not on track. All right, so what does qualitative research offer us about this? So I'm not going to, because of time constraints, I'm just not going to talk much about the first two, but there's an interesting study by Hatfield that analysed therapists' notes in situations where the OQ data, outcome questionnaire data, was showing that something was going badly wrong and the clients were really deteriorating. And they found that less than half of the therapists seemed to mention anything like this in the notes. But on the other hand, 40% of them did say something. A survey by Bystedt and colleagues on CBT therapists on negative outcomes found that these therapists, at least the ones that answered the survey, this was like open-ended survey questions, actually had a lot to say about negative outcomes. So it wasn't that therapists are just kind of cutting off any thoughts about negative outcomes. But the study that I find very, very interesting in relation to this is a study by Anders Verbar and colleagues in Sweden. So this is part of a big study of psychodynamic therapy for young adults. And they complete outcome data. The clients were interviewed, the therapists were interviewed, and so on. So in this particular paper, they're focusing on the poor outcome cases where they had good data sets. So they had 8 poor outcome cases. And the particular thing that I think is relevant to this question I've got about are therapists able to be aware of poor outcomes? These therapists were interviewed after the first or second session, right? And after the first or second session, at this point, obviously, they didn't know that this person was going to be a poor outcome case. After the first or second session, they said there's something difficult here. There's a split person. There's somebody who, on the one hand, is actively participating, has got a lot to say, is very involved in therapy, but on the other hand, there's something that, like, they're not there. There's something else that I cannot get a hold of, right? And at the end of therapy, they said they'd been trying week by week everything they could to get access to this negative half, and they just had not been able to do that. And they acknowledged that it was a poor outcome case. But the other thing they said, and this links to actually quite a lot of qualitative research by Anders and Camilla von Bello and other people, is that qualitative studies of poor outcome cases tend to show a somewhat nuanced picture, that it isn't just purely like the therapy was no good or harmful. It's like there's a balance. Like, on balance, it wasn't helpful, and that's shown in the scores. But actually, there was a few things that were helpful to me, and you can see in that study, some of them at least went on to see another therapist and were helped. So the final thing I'd like to say is not really. It's not really referenced at all, but it's just, this is based on my own experience, trying to use qualitative evidence to inform my practice and what I've tried to kind of teach students and so on. And the gist of it is that it's a dialogical process. I mean, I don't know about everybody else attending this, but for me, the idea of reading a paper and then there's something in the paper that kind of makes a difference to my practice, this does not work for me. When I read a paper, I am engaging with a qualitative paper. I'm not talking about a quantitative paper where there's a kind of headline news finding. I'm talking about a qualitative paper that's sort of exploring complex lived experience. That, for me, making sense of it is a dialogical process. And there's various aspects of this here, but one of the things that has been very moving and meaningful for me is to be able to discuss qualitative papers within groups of people. And often that's been students, right? So a group of 8 or 10 students would have read a qualitative study. It would probably be one of my favorite qualitative studies that I've asked them to read, a paper that I've read several times. And these students basically know virtually nothing about research, right? They're beginners, they're master's students. And some of them say things that I'd never thought of. Like they're drawn to something in the paper and say, look at this statement. How does this fit with this other statement and things like that? And I think there's then a kind of way of responding to qualitative research and kind of finding ways to connect between the research and our practice that we need to kind of know. I think we need to know more about. So just to kind of wrap up, I actually think qualitative research has got a huge potential to inform policy and practice, but I think we need to demonstrate this, right? I think we've been asserting it quite effectively in recent times, but we need to show this. We need to prove to people that, say, a guideline of a particular area of practice that's either entirely or mainly informed by qualitative evidence does actually have value for people. I think we need to know more about how people actually read qualitative papers and make sense of them. And then I think both these things of kind of demonstrating the practical value of qualitative research and finding out how people use it loop back into the qualitative research process, just like randomized controlled trials have looped back into practice, and they've looped back into the design of randomized controlled trials. And so anyway, I'll stop there because I've gone way over time, and yeah, that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Well, I never thought that I would say this, but I was right and you were wrong. This was very thought-provoking. So thank you. It was great. Why don't we now, after these three fantastic presentations, why don't we just open this up for discussions and questions? Wolfgang, you have a questions, right?
Yes, I just first want to congratulate you all, like Heidi, Bill, and John, about this excellent presentation about causality theory as well as implementation issues around qualitative research. For myself, I had always a little bit, I mean, it's probably all known that I'm more from a quantitative perspective. For myself, it always felt a little bit uncomfortable to do a lot of, I mean, we have done a couple of mixed method studies and some qualitative studies. I always felt a little bit reluctant in terms of how for the process measures, how clear they are. I mean, and especially using the term of causality, given that our constructs, also in terms of theories, that our constructs are often not so clearly defined. And now recently, I just read this a few days ago, and also connected to our work, that ChatGPT did, for example, go through the Turing test. Now that's the first time in history that there is kind of a machine being able to generate meaning, where we as humans are suddenly can't make a difference anymore. And I was just wondering, would such a new technology, for example, be able to help us to more clearly define this, and even to support something like qualitative research? It's a little bit just an idea I got. Yeah.
So you want to throw these questions to any of these three?
Yeah, all three of them in a way, yes.
Yes, of course, but I don't know how. It's too new, but it would be very surprising to me if it didn't have a big impact on us. I'm as curious as you.
Yeah, I wonder also. I don't know what will happen. It seems like the advantage of having humans is we're able to create new information, and I don't know to what extent that'll be possible. We also were able to understand things around cultural situation, and we can think on many different levels at the same time. I'm not sure how that will be replicated or how that could be useful or not.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm not convinced that Chat GBT is a person, even if it has passed the Turing test. The thing I'm confident about is that it will have a big impact, and I think it will be useful but I don't know how.
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add, really. I don't like it. I don't actually think it's a good way to go, personally. And but I mean, it's going to happen, isn't it? Yeah, so I don't like it, and it worries me. And I think that in a kind of I don't know, technologized and kind of fragmented world, that kind of person-to-person relationship is maybe such a precious thing. And it's maybe, why would we give away our unique selling point? You know what I mean? Yeah.
There's another question in the chat, Louis. Yeah.
There's a good question in the chat, indeed, by Elena there. Elena, do you want to voice it?
Yes, okay, thank you. I was asking, especially Heidi, if because of the fact that qualitative research involves a small sample, can you, is it okay to make a causative conclusion, or would it be just a relational conclusion? Thank you.
I would say that the sample doesn't really matter. The sample size in qualitative research isn't really the issue as much as, are you able to map the variability within the phenomenon that you're describing in a thorough way that is useful for the question that you have. So if you have a question that you're asking and your qualitative findings provide an answer for that question, you can say that it seems like there are these causal processes were described and are real for these participants who describe those experiences. And you're not saying that you're not using generalized sampling based generalization, right? So you're not trying to say I'm establishing that this causality works for the majority of this population, but you're saying in this issue, in this study, these are causal processes that we studied, that we noticed, that are real and should be understood and can inform the research. And I think that that's very valid.
Thank you very much. That was very, very clear, and it clarified my mind. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think the causal processes, what's happening within the change process, right, is often absent otherwise. Yeah.
Heidi,
I just wanted
how would you address the issue of a potential, there's a link between two event there, a potential that it's correlational, or that there's a third variable that is actually playing. So you see a link between two variables. How can you address that this is causal, that it's a cause and effect relationship? I think this is something that many quantitative researcher would raise.
Right. Well, you're limited to the fact that you're talking about what people are experiencing, right? So you can say that people experience this as causal. People describe this as motivating them, right? I'm sure you are just talking with you, right? You're clear on like, this is motivating for me, right? What motivates me is nature when I go exercise, right? Like, you know what the things that motivate you. And so I think it's perfectly valid to say that these things are described as causal. People experience them as causal. they identify these as causal processes that are important in their lives because they do, right? And then I think if people want to go ahead and do other quant research, it's wonderful, right? You have research that builds on that, and you can evaluate different things. But I don't think there's any reason to undersell or to understate that people do describe and have access and are knowledgeable about their own experiences and are able to articulate them.
I interrupted you, Bill. You had, thank you, Heidi.
Well, I want to give it an answer that changes the frame of reference. I really agree with what Heidi's saying, but I think that there's a more kind of traditional view of causation that I think qualitative. In addition to that, qualitative research can also speak to that. I was trying to make the point. I mean, for me, I think causation is a theoretical issue, and causation is built into theories. In fact, that's one of the main things that theories do, is to explain how one thing causes another thing. And so, so that if you have if you take that kind of view, then any evidence that supports the theory supports the causal aspects of that theory. I mean, my argument that I was trying to make was that although it uses a different strategy, qualitative research is every bit as good as statistical hypothesis testing, anyway, for supporting, that is, giving small increments of confidence to theories, to causal theories. And so if you can, in a sense, you can play at the same game. That is, it's not the same. It's not a different strategy, really, or it's a different research strategy, but the logic is actually the same. You're supporting a causal theory.
Thank you.
I think it's also just fine to ask. You can ask people directly, do you think this is correlational or causal? And people will tell you.
Mhm. So I have Hades.
Hi, everybody. So nice to see you all this difficult time in Israel. I wanted to continue on John's point. What do you think about training in qualitative research, and specifically training psychotherapies in qualitative research? So many graduate programs put such an emphasis on quantitative research and very sophisticated quantitative statistical analysis, all the things that Wolfgang is such an expert in. But how much do they really give room to train in qualitative research? And I guess it's too long a question. What's the best way to do it? Or just if you can give a few tips on that. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's hard for me to answer that in this way, in this sense, that, I mean, my career has been spent in Britain and Ireland, with training people and supervising research of students who are counselors and psychotherapists, and a lot of that kind of set of people have, I mean, some of them have come from psychology degrees, but they haven't all come from psychology degrees. So it's like, it's different in a really fundamental way, I think, from like clinical psychology or counseling psychology, which to me has probably kind of socialized people into thinking quantitatively, you know, through doing an undergraduate training and things. So my experience has been that the students and trainees that I've worked on are deeply skeptical about quantitative research, right? They need to be persuaded to take it seriously, right? And they they don't like measures. They don't like the idea of measures and things like that. And then they are very open to qualitative research, and they come from backgrounds, say, in social work or the arts and things like that, that have already got a kind of hermeneutic, if you like, kind of tradition to draw on, and they're bringing in skills and awareness like that. So I haven't really had any problems in teaching qualitative research to these people, because it's very enjoyable exchange between us, right? So, but I think that the okay, but if you stand back from that, I personally think that research is best taught in some kind of apprenticeship mode, where people are doing research. It's not like textbooks. I mean, I've written research textbooks and they're really boring. It's like, who wants a research textbook? But to be involved in a research study, right? So, I mean, Heidi's got examples of this. She's published at least 1 or 2 papers on it, of like a group of students, doing a study together within the core, a course, whether it's a semester or a whole year or something like that. And from the beginning to the end, they bang through the whole process of ethical approval, designing the study, doing interviews, analyzing it, using ground theory, publishing it, and things like that. This is tremendously exciting. And I think the other thing that's exciting is to integrate research kind of, I don't know, tools and ideas and methods into ordinary, into sort of teaching of therapy skills, right? So it's like, I mean, I've had classes where we have taken Bill Stiles' assimilation model, and, the students have been presenting case studies of their work with clients. And we said, right, how does this help us to make sense of it, right? And then it's not forcing, I mean, it's kind of inviting them to look at some of all these wonderful assimilation model case studies and things like that. And you see what I mean? And I think lots of things, I mean, I had a whole phase of students, Lester Luborsky's,
CCRT.
Yeah, CCRT, right?
Right.
So, like, here's the CCRT, here's the research on the CCRT. This helps you to understand what's going on between you and your client. Just look at a bit, if, like students transcribing a session with a client, it's like the CCRT jumps out at you, doesn't it? So, I mean, to me, that is the way to do it. And it's like lots of things I would think are really important in training, like at the moment, anti-racist training and kind of decolonizing training and things like that. The trainer or lecturer has to speak from the heart, right? So I'm standing there. I believe in research as someone that's going to help us to do better work as therapists, right? So I'm trying to share that. You see what I mean? Anyway, I'm taking up too much time, but I think that would be my answer to that. Yeah.
I was going to just add that I do teach all my graduate level courses, not undergraduate, but graduate courses, so that in a research team model. So I usually have IRB approval before the class begins. I sometimes have participants before the class begins lined up. And then we do a project during the class, and then we work together to publish the article. And we've so far published, every class has had a published article where all the students are co-authors on the article. Usually at the end of the class, we end with a
Wow.
very, very rough draft of the article. And then usually some section of the class continues on because they are devoted to the project by then. And they sometimes collect more participants or just work to refine the article. But I've written an article about that class structure that people could find if they're interested in that structure. But I find it really helpful because then the students are really engaged because they know this is like a real project. Yeah.
Thank you.
And all of this is very consistent with a wonderful panel that took place at last week at the North American Society for Psychotherapy Research, NASPR. It was a panel about how learning a coding process like the CRT would actually be very helpful as a way to becoming a practitioner. So questions to John, but to anybody else, but this was directly related. This is related to something that you mentioned, John, about the issue about the NICE guidelines. So those policy making that from the government that says, well, these are what is evidence-based, and this is what the clinicians should be using, and there is the gold standard is perceived as the randomized clinical trials. And so the question is, there's been a lot of movement that has been taking place over the last few years. Heidi published one, if not two, paper in the American Psychologist about how to do qualitative research, how to review qualitative research, how to write the results of qualitative research. For the first time, there's 2 chapters in the handbook on qualitative research. There is a tremendous number of qualitative research that I've published in psychotherapy research, for example. Today, Juan and I were exchanging, this is the record number of participants, 125 people came in. So this is, it seems to me it's gaining traction. What would it take, Heidi, John, Bill, to actually have qualitative research to really be endorsed as a solid, recognized, rigorous source of informations that we can rely on for the empirical foundation of psychotherapy?
John, I don't know. It seemed like Louis was addressing it to you. Do you want to speak first? Happy to add.
Yeah, I think I think some of this was in my final slide, but I didn't really get a chance to expand on it. I think we need to start doing it, right? And that I think if you, I mean, I've been around a long time, and I mean, I remember when systematic reviews, meta-analyses of outcome studies started. I remember all that, Smith, Class, and Miller and stuff like that. Yeah, right. And when you look back at that now, it seemed very kind of amateurish, didn't it? It was like, and kind of what happened then was that the people realized to do a kind of credible randomized clinical trial, you had to do certain things and kind of have adherence scales and blah blah, all these sorts of things, right? And it then led to the quality of randomized controlled trials and improving, and then debates around all that and so forth. And I don't think we've really started that yet. Yeah, and I think that it's I think the big question that is that would get a lot of people's attention is around outcomes, right? That, I mean, if you look back at the history of therapy research, there's been more, I would say, more money spent on outcome research than on anything else, right? Because it's so socially important. Yeah. Now, I think that at this point in time, what we have is a body of qualitative research that kind of asks some very difficult questions of randomized trials and quantitative studies, right? About what do people do when they fill in questionnaires? Yeah. What are the questionnaires measuring, right? There's studies of the clients, the meaning of outcome for clients. Clients use different criteria from evaluating outcomes than the studies are measuring. You know, most studies are measuring, and so on and so forth. And I don't know. I think it would be possible to do some kind of qualitative analysis. I mean, a kind of a meta-analysis of outcomes based on qualitative studies, and it wouldn't be brilliant, yeah, because there's not enough such studies, and they don't kind of learn from each other enough, right? But once it was out there, I think it would set a process in motion. Does that make sense, Louis? Does that?
It does make sense. And in fact, you know, again, I will disagree with you. It may be brilliant. And in one of the chapters of the handbook, there is a section about this is the outcome that qualitative analyses have come up with that are at the minimum complementary to Likert scale. So I think that's what you should do next, starting tomorrow, John, is to write a qualitative meta-analysis, and it's going to be brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I'll be second author if you want, just to kind of push the idea.
I just wanted to jump in to add to that. I think that the other thing is that qualitative researchers need to get involved in the formation of guidelines, right? I think that we often see it as not our area, and then we don't volunteer or we don't get involved. And I think quantitative researchers need to say, why is there not a qualitative person on this committee? Yeah. Where are the qualitative people? And there needs to be some responsibility for supporting a pluralistic methodology when we approach things like clinical guidelines. I think that that's really important. And my experience has been so far has been positive. Like I'm on the APA advisory committee for these clinical guidelines, and we've moved forward to try to put in proposals to get funding for doing some qualitative work. So I don't know if we'll get the funding or not. We'll see what happens, but they're supportive of, of trying different things. And so I think that to some extent it's our communities, because we're all over the world, thinking about how to get involved in your own country where people are creating guidelines. And I know we have a collaborative paper that's hopefully going to be coming out soon, where we had almost 20 qualitative researchers from around the world talking about clinical guidlines and how to incorporate qualitative research. So I think that this is a pressing thing that globally people are caring about. And, I'm really hoping that increasingly that we start seeing that it becomes unacceptable to have clinical practice guidelines that aren't considering qualitative research and clients and therapists' experience and practice.
Just to add, I think that to some extent it is happening, and the things you're saying, that this was a big audience showing up for this is kind of evidence that things are happening. I think there's still work to go. The proof is going to be producing research that that is convincing. I think the context, I think, is that RCTs of psychotherapy, the kind of gold standard that was built for drug studies, is problematic, and many people, I think, on this Zoom probably have put in there or about the problems. Now, I don't think qualitative research has magically solved the problems, and it may be that I suspect the answer is going to be in rephrasing the question, but and to research that better fits the issues that come up in psychotherapy, which is quite different. But I think it's possible, and I think it's happening. The issue is going to be demonstrating. We have to do it, and it has to be convincing.
I think we have the time for another question. Joe, you voiced something in the chat. Would it be okay to raise it? Joe, is you still there? Yes, could you voice it verbally? All right, so let me just try it. Would it be fair to say that the difficulty in tracking the efficacy of a qualitative research piece is that the question can be more of a curiosity for the researcher, and so make sense to the outcome, of a curiosity for the researcher, and so makes the outcome quite niche. Not sure that I said that correctly.
I think that a challenge is efficacy. Really, that word is so linked to clinical trials. It's harder to connect to qualitative research. All questions that we study are curiosities for researchers. I can't think of a researcher who will do a study that they're not curious about the findings for, right? So it's hard for me to connect that. I see Elizabeth's question, which is about the idea of a biased pool of research. I think that qualitative research is an area that is good at sidestepping the file door problem, because we do not begin as researchers with a hypothesis. We begin often with an open question, and with really working to be open to see what our findings are. So there's not so that's not so much of an issue for qualitative research as it has been for quantitative research, where there's a hypothesis that might not be upheld. Those are my quick answers.
Well, you were referring to Elizabeth's note there, and I think that the first sentence of her note is summing this up very nicely. That was fantastic. The three speakers were wonderful. And I love the sentence, Heidi, of where are the qualitative researchers? I think that that should actually guide the policymakers. And I do agree with you that the more quantitatively oriented researchers should make a point. In other words, that if the lobbying is only coming from the qualitative researchers, or if it's coming only from the students and only coming from the clinician, it's not going to be enough. We need to be convincing people who actually are writing up and sanctioning practice guidelines and research guidelines, and importantly, training guidelines. We need to kind of say, as you said, where are the qualitative researchers? On this, and on behalf of Michael and Wolfgang, I'd like to say thank you to the three of you. And thanks for everybody who was here. And we will see you in November. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.